palace alive. Athanasia looked around the silent surroundings, reflecting that there was not a soul in sight as usual. She decided to explore elsewhere that day. Then she stumbled upon statues that appeared to be made entirely of gold, which left her stunned. In disbelief, she wondered aloud if they were real gold, noting that all the statues in her palace were made of marble. Overwhelmed by the sight, she considered taking one, thinking no one would notice. Curiously, she began inspecting each statue to confirm they were indeed gold. Without realizing it, she bit one of the statues. However, she suddenly heard a voice behind her questioning when such a pest had taken residence in the palace, sending a chill of fear down Athanasia's spine. Athanasia anxiously twirled around, and one of her bundles dropped, spilling gold jewelry and diamonds all over the floor. Standing before her was none other than her father, the cruel Emperor Claude, accompanied by his guard. Claude, observing Athanasia, remarked that her face seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Athanasia, scared, reflected on the striking similarity between their jewel-like eyes. She had never seen him in person, but she recognized him instantly, Claude de Algerobalia. Claude recalled that she resembled a dancer from Sodana, causing Athanasia to become even more anxious and unable to believe what was happening. She wondered why Claude was there, thinking it was too soon for this encounter, as she was only 5 years old and not in the rear garden of the Emperor's palace. Claude dismissed any significance of her identity, declaring it irrelevant. His guard called out, "Your Majesty," as Claude reached his hand towards Athanasia's face, smiling. Claude then reminisced, recalling a name given to her, Athanasia. Hearing this, Athanasia's heartbeat quickened with anxiety. Claude continued, mentioning that she was just a newborn at the time, barely able to steady her neck. In the Obelian Empire, only the official heir to the throne is permitted to have a name related to immortality, a privilege solely granted by the emperor to the successor. On the day of the massacre at the Ruby Palace, Claude had planned to kill Athanasia as well. However, when he heard the regal name Diana had given her daughter, he remarked with amusement, "How amusing. I wonder if you'll live up to your namesake and manage to survive." Claude noted that Athanasia had grown quite a bit since then. Athanasia trembled, reflecting on his words. She wondered if he was implying that she had lived long enough and it was time for her to die. She questioned why he was doing this, recalling that in the book, he had ignored the 9-year-old Athanasia and walked away. She was perplexed as to why he was paying attention to her now. Meanwhile, another bundle of gold jewelry and wealth, hidden in Athanasia's dress, dropped. Everyone was surprised. Claude stared at her, and Athanasia sweated in fear. Claude lifted Athanasia, leaving her confused. He remarked on her weight, saying he had known she would be a hefty child from her chubby cheeks, but hadn't expected her to be this heavy. Athanasia was shocked, reflecting on his words about her chubby cheeks, her being hefty and heavy. She tried to ignore those comments and questioned why he was talking to her in the first place. She angrily thought about how he probably didn't even bleed when stabbed because he was nothing but ice on the inside. She seethed internally, thinking of him as a bastard who only loved Jeanette and didn't consider Athanasia his daughter. Claude asked what she was doing in his palace. All of Athanasia's rage vanished instantly. She couldn't believe it. His palace? She reflected on the stark difference between this austere place and the opulence of the Ruby Palace. She realized that this must be where he lived and understood why the 9-year-old Athanasia had ended up at the Emperor's palace. They were so close to each other. Claude noticed the statue Athanasia had bitten earlier, causing her to flinch. A guard commented that she must have thought it was a toy. Athanasia's mind was flooded with thoughts, wondering if she was done for, if he was going to kill her for walking into his palace without permission, if her head was going to roll because she left teeth marks on his cherub statue, and because she was still alive. Claude tossed Athanasia towards the guard, indicating that she must have wandered off while playing in her palace. He instructed Felix to carry her away, suggesting that he and the guests could enjoy some refreshments together. Inside Claude's palace, Athanasia sat on a sofa with tea and snacks before her, utterly bewildered by the situation. She trembled, avoiding his eyes. Claude remarked that he hadn't realized she couldn't speak, finding the silence tedious. Athanasia, feeling anxious, wondered if he wanted to do away with her because she was boring. Claude asked if she simply chose not to talk. Athanasia, using Athie as a voice, giggled nervously. Claude expressed relief at finally hearing her voice and questioned why she hadn't spoken all this time. Athanasia was at a loss for words, unsure how to respond. Felix whispered to Claude, "I regret to inform you, Your Majesty, but children of Her Highness's age are often rather shy around strangers." Claude responded with a questioning tone, and internally, Athanasia seethed with frustration. She reflected on how children could indeed be timid around unfamiliar people, but speculated that adults might feel the same way around Claude. Despite her internal turmoil, Athanasia put on a brave face and smiled in front of Claude. However, inside she silently sobbed, feeling defeated and hoping he would let her go. Claude called for Felix, who responded promptly, asking how he could assist. Claude then instructed Felix to leave them alone. As Felix exited the room, Athanasia panicked internally, feeling anxious about being left alone with Claude. Claude remarked that Athy must be her nickname. Athanasia corrected him firmly, stating her full name, Athanasia. Claude questioned if she knew the meaning behind her name. Athanasia, feeling scared and realizing the seriousness of the situation, clenched her fists and decided to act knave to mask her fear. Athanasia reflected on her name, considering it fit for emperors, something even Claude, the emperor himself, couldn't possess. Names in the Obelian Empire were tied to eternity and immortality, reserved for the official imperial heir. Claude had seized power by killing his brother, but never obtained a name befitting an emperor. Athanasia worried that Claude might be displeased with her name and could order her execution. She acted harmless and reflected that she posed no threat, expressing no interest in the crown. Her only desire was to live quietly. Despite her impressive name, she saw herself as nothing more than a 5-year-old freeloader. Claude urged Athanasia to eat, noticing her trembling as she reached for the snacks. He mentioned he had instructed the servants to bring out food that children typically enjoyed, adding that if she left it untouched, he would have to punish the servants. Athanasia trembled internally, interpreting it as a threat and thinking poorly of him. However, she forced a smile and politely thanked him for the food. Athanasia reflected on her predicament, already anticipating indigestion and feeling certain she would fall ill after eating. She feared the consequences if she didn't finish her food, imagining Claude might harm the entire palace staff. She felt pale with fear, but decided to put on a nervous smile, commenting on how tasty the food was. Internally, she longed for Lily and regretted her situation, terrified of engaging in conversation with Claude or even meeting his gaze. She pleaded mentally for him to release her, regretting her impulsive decision to enter what felt like a demon's lair for the sake of gold. Claude asked Athanasia where she had learned her manners from. Athanasia responded that Lily had taught her. Claude acknowledged Lily as Lillian York. Athanasia flinched inwardly, wondering how Claude knew Lily's full name. Claude explained that 5 years ago, Lily had intercepted him and asked permission to care for Athanasia. He noted that Lily must still be by her side. Athanasia reflected on Lily's actions with astonishment, realizing Lily had stood up to Claude for her sake. Claude continued, mentioning that Lily now managed the Ruby Palace. Athanasia was deeply touched by Lily's dedication and actions. Claude remarked that he had no doubt Lily and Athanasia's mother were the only ones who weren't executed for standing in his way. Athanasia, feeling nervous, continued eating without saying a word. Claude questioned if she even knew who he was despite sitting in his presence. Shocked, Athanasia dropped her spoon, reflecting internally that she was in serious trouble. She avoided looking away from his eyes, realizing he was scrutinizing her. She speculated that this opportunity to sit with him might be a test, a reward for piquing his interest. She feared Claude might be deciding whether to keep her alive longer or kill her now. She wondered if a similar test had been part of the story involving the 9-year-old Athanasia and Claude. Confused and anxious, she didn't know what to do next. Athanasia responded with a hesitant "father" to Claude's question. Internally, she chastised herself for the awkward choice of addressing him as father, realizing they had nothing in common to discuss. She panicked, considering it a monumental mistake that might lead to her demise. She questioned why she hadn't just asked him to kill her instead. However, Claude continued to look at her without any immediate negative reaction. Athanasia reflected, surprised that the situation hadn't turned into a disaster. She began to reconsider her approach, recalling Claude's fondness for Jeanette in the book. She wondered if simply trying to capture his interest might be her best strategy after all. Athanasia nervously mustered the courage to call Claude Daddy. There was an awkward silence as Claude didn't respond immediately. Athanasia's heartbeat raced with fear as she desperately wished for any reaction from him. Internally, she cursed herself, wondering why she had tried such a risky approach. Despite her internal panic, she forced a smile and tried to act cute, addressing him again as Daddy. However, deep inside, she feared that those words might seal her fate. Athanasia reflected on her recent ordeal, acknowledging that she had made it out alive. However, her disappearance from the room where she was supposed to be napping had caused an uproar in the Ruby Palace. When an emperor's guard brought her back in his arms, the maids immediately suspected kidnapping. They glared at Felix with anger, causing him to nervously sweat. Athanasia, recalling how Felix had left her alone with Claude, mentally decided not to help him. Felix then conveyed that His Majesty intended to call on Princess Athanasia again in the near future, a statement that made both Athanasia and the maids anxious. The maids in particular were taken aback and wondered what Felix had just said. Athanasia observed the maids and wondered about the mix of fear and joy on their faces, speculating that it might be because they finally had the Emperor's interest. She questioned why Claude wanted to see her again, feeling a strong aversion to the idea. Despite her reluctance, she acknowledged that nothing in her life had ever gone the way she wanted and that she had no choice but to obey the Emperor's every command. If he told her to jump, she would have to ask, how high? Just then, Lily asked if she was hurt. But before Athanasia could respond, she began to vomit. Lily expressed her worry, and Athanasia reflected that she needed to get all the stress out of her system first. At night, Athanasia reflected on her failed Plan A, which was to stay holed up in the Ruby Palace until she died without being noticed by Claude. She realized she had been too complacent, believing she would be fine if she was careful around her 9th birthday. She was frustrated that she hadn't known the unadorned palace was Claude's residence and wondered why the Ruby Palace was so close to the Emperor's dwelling. This place wasn't even for the Empress, it was for concubines. Thinking about Plan B, she decided to amass a getaway fund and escape the palace before turning 18. She felt this plan had a chance of succeeding and considered whether she needed to keep hoarding her valuables. Fidgeting, she thought about disguising herself as a maid and slipping out through a secret opening when the time came to leave the palace. Athanasia considered her most ambitious plan, Plan C, winning Claude over by charming him. She felt chills at the thought, but it didn't seem totally impossible. She reminded herself that she knew how the story unfolded and believed she could get close enough to Claude to avoid his urge to kill her, even if she could make him dote on her. Reflecting on the earlier embarrassing moment when she had called him Daddy, she cringed but noted that he hadn't executed her on the spot. Embarrassing as it was, she resolved to carry out both Plans B and C simultaneously, viewing any humiliating deeds and resulting embarrassment as investments in her future. Just then, Lily arrived and informed her it was time for bed. Athanasia asked Lily to sing her to sleep. The next day, they met with Claude. He greeted Lily, acknowledging that it had been a while since they last met. Lily curtsied respectfully, offering blessings and glory to the son of the Obelian Empire. Athanasia found the situation intimidating. Claude admitted that he had failed to pay proper attention to the true princess of the Empire due to being occupied in recent years. He commended Lily for ensuring Athanasia's safe and sound growth. Lily expressed her gratitude for his kind words. Internally, Athanasia was incredulous, reflecting that Claude hadn't just failed to pay proper attention, he had completely forgotten about her existence. Claude declared that he would